It started in 1921 with a lost diamond ring. John Larson's brand new lie detector made quick work of finding the thief, and as the years went on, the polygraph dragged confessions from ruthless killers and even unmasked a Soviet spy working in the heart of American government, propelling an ambitious congressman to the Whitehouse. A rookie detective, a business-savvy psychologist, and an amateur magician would pull the fledgling technology in different and often conflicting directions. But of all the deceptions and lies that the machine uncovered, perhaps the biggest deceit was at the heart of the machine itself. In spring of 1921, the women's-only private dorm at the University of California, Berkeley, was rocked by a crime wave. College Hall, located in the northeastern corner of campus, was home to 90 young, mostly affluent women whose possessions were being stolen. On the night of March 30th, 1921, a first-year student called Margaret Taylor couldn't find her diamond ring. It was worth $400, more than $6,500 today. Taylor had no choice but to contact the police, so she went to Berkeley's City Hall. In the early 1920s, the basement of City Hall housed the Berkeley Police Department, and it was the center of a policing revolution, with Police Chief August Vollmer at the heart of it. Vollmer was already developing the legendary reputation that would see him dubbed the father of modern policing. He was the first police chief in America to buy bicycles for his deputies. He created the first fleet of police cars. He installed a signaling system to improve response times, and he implemented stringent procedures for collecting evidence and keeping records. Vollmer also became one of the first people in the world to treat crime as a problem that could be solved with science, and he pushed for formal education for police officers. In 1907, he instituted a new training program teaching fingerprinting, criminal law, photography, public health, psychiatry, and more. But it soon became clear that some of Vollmer's officers couldn't or wouldn't adapt to the chief's vision for the police force. He was still being forced to discipline and fire his officers on a regular basis. Bribery and corruption were rife, as was the practice of giving suspects the third degree. For many of Vollmer's police officers, the third degree was the preferred method of solving crime. It refers to a method of extracting confessions using extreme brutality, both physical and mental. This was a far cry from the methodical, evidence-based policing Vollmer envisaged. Vollmer wanted educated, intelligent men for the police force, and he knew where to find them: the University of California in Berkeley. He ran an advert saying, "College men wanted for police force, interesting experience, learn a new profession, serve on the Berkeley police force while you go to college. Contact August Vollmer, Chief of Police." One of the men that answered the advert was 29-year-old John Larson, who had just earned his PhD in physiology from the university. This was another first for Vollmer's innovative police department, a patrolman with a doctorate. Larson had written his thesis on fingerprints as a predictor of deviant tendencies, and he was a dedicated scientist. When he wasn't moonlighting on patrol, he was writing a book on fingerprinting or auditing classes on criminal psychiatry. In early 1921, Gus Vollmer called Larson into his office. Vollmer had stumbled across an article in a scientific journal about the work of Harvard lawyer and psychologist William Marston. Marston had developed a crude device that measured blood pressure while a subject was being interviewed. He discovered that he could tell, based on blood pressure readings alone, when someone was lying. When Larson came to Vollmer's office, the chief asked him, "John, have you ever studied anything about detecting lies?" Marston's method used a simple blood pressure cuff and a stopwatch to measure a suspect's emotional response to questions. Vollmer wondered if this method could be refined, and Larson, was the perfect man for the job. After a few weeks of tinkering and with the help of a lab technician at the university, Larson came back to Vollmer with an ugly device made of a series of rubber tubes and a roll of charcoal blackened paper attached to a wooden board. Larson's device did more than just measure blood pressure. It also measured heart rate and monitored changes in breathing patterns. The finished machine was a mess, a Frankenstein device that was a mixture of all the research that had come before. Larson named his device the cardiopneumopsychograph, or simply the Apparatus, but it would go down in history as the Polygraph. After Margaret Taylor contacted the station about her stolen diamond ring, Vollmer assigned the case to veteran of the force Jack Fisher. When Fisher visited the dorm at College Hall, he found no shortage of suspects. The dorm's residents were quick to spread rumors and hurl accusations at one another. Fisher found himself mired in a tangle of contradictory information. Growing impatient, he went to Vollmer for advice, and the police chief saw an opportunity to field test John Larson's new apparatus. "John, I think we've got a real case to work on." He suggested Larson take his apparatus to the dormitory and test all 90 residents. Larson's experimental method, largely the same as the one still used by polygraph examiners today, involved comparing the body's responses to innocuous control questions versus how it reacts to questions relating to the crime being investigated. At College Hall, Larson attached his machine to woman after woman, repeating his list of questions again and again, with Fisher and Vollmer keeping a close eye on proceedings. Then he came to Helen Graham. Graham was slightly older than most of the other residents of College Hall. Graham's roommates were suspicious of her clothing and fine jewelry, which one of them told Detective Fisher seemed out of step with her modest Kansas family background. Graham showed no emotion as Larson worked his way through the list of questions, until he got to the ones about the missing jewelry. "Did you take Miss Taylor's ring?" Larson asked. After she answered a quick no, he glanced at the chart. "The test shows you stole it," he said. Graham seemed to stop breathing. She glared at Larson.
"I think all these questions are an insult. Just because I'm excited and mad at being asked all these questions, the needle jumps and you think I'm lying."
Her eyes burned with rage. She started shouting.
"It's the 3rd degree, that's what it is. The needle shoots up and I'm a liar."
Helen Graham stormed out of the room before Larson, Vollmer, or Fisher could stop her. But they were confident they had their culprit, even without a direct confession. Over the coming weeks, the police continued to hound Helen Graham, and eventually she broke down and confessed to stealing the ring. Larson's lie detector had just solved its first case. Helen Graham withdrew from the university, moved into a hotel, and prepared to return to Kansas. But in the basement of City Hall, John Larson felt that something wasn't right. He did some more digging, and he found that Helen Graham had a troubled past. She had been abused as a child. She was entangled in several passionate affairs, including an affair with a married medical student. And her sexual transgressions were a source of malicious gossip at College Hall. Helen Graham was a woman burdened by guilt and under enormous stress. No sooner had she returned home to Kansas than she wrote to Larson saying her confession had been obtained by trickery and only out of fear that her affair would be exposed. Privately, Larson was haunted by Helen Graham's words.
"Just because I'm excited and mad at being asked all these questions, the needle jumps and you think I'm lying."
As Larson worked on more cases that year, he started to realize that Helen Graham was right. A lie detector test is inherently stressful, and being asked about a crime can cause an emotional response regardless of whether a person is guilty or not. August Vollmer didn't share Larson's misgivings. He believed Larson's machine was an unconditional success. It was a clean and scientific way for the police to banish deceit and root out the guilty without the need for the 3rd degree. 17-year-old Leonarde Keeler was a budding magician. At school, he entertained his classmates with sleight-of-hand card tricks. but outside of school, he had fallen in with a bad crowd, and his father was concerned. Leonarde's father was friendly with Gus Vollmer, and he asked the police chief if the boy, who also had an interest in psychology and criminal investigation, could spend some time at the station. Vollmer agreed, and for Keeler, what started as a way to pass the time until he returned to school soon became an obsession. He started to spend most of his days at the department, hanging around outside Vollmer's office, learning about the fingerprint system and other branches of innovative detective work that were in development. The lie detector in particular sparked his interest. Vollmer introduced Keeler to his other protege, John Larson, and Keeler spent the next months learning everything he could about the machine. When he wasn't in the lab watching Larson conducting tests, he was studying the charts or photographing them. Vollmer also gave Keeler free rein to experiment with the device himself. He took delight in showing off to his classmates night after night at City Hall. Keeler soon found that Larson's apparatus had many drawbacks. Setting up the machine was a long and fiddly business, and the record, once made, was extremely fragile. At Vollmer's suggestion, Keeler began tinkering with the machine, trying to make the device more reliable, user-friendly, and more portable. In 1923, all three men would move on. Vollmer left Berkeley to head the Los Angeles Police Department, and Keeler, now a university student, followed, transferring from the University of California at Berkeley to UCLA, where he continued to tinker with the lie detector. Larson, meanwhile, moved to Chicago for medical school, taking a job with the Institute for Juvenile Research. He also continued working on his own apparatus. In the autumn of 1922, Larson received a letter from William Marston, inventor of the Marston deception test, the crude machine that had inspired Larson to create his lie detector. Marston was an extroverted character, and he made some expansive claims about his machine, saying it was practically infallible. In his letter, Marston asked for details about how Larson's version of the lie detector had performed during investigations in Berkeley. Marston was trying to get his deception test introduced in court, which would have cemented his machine as a must-have tool for law enforcement. Larson, much more scientifically minded and modest, gently warned Marston that his deception test was unreliable. But it was too late. Marston had already talked his way into the middle of a high-profile murder case. In November 1920, Robert Brown, a prominent doctor in Washington, D.C., was killed at his home. 16 months later, police arrested and charged James Alfonso Fry for the murder. According to the police, Fry confessed to the crime. However, Fry later said that he had been tricked into confessing. With a shaky alibi and a confession on record, Fry's lawyers were desperate to save their client from the death penalty. They brought in Professor William Marston to administer a lie detector test. According to Marston, Fry passed the test. James Fry was an innocent man. At the trial in 1922, Marston's evidence was thrown out almost immediately. Chief Justice Walter McCoy went on record saying that the real experts at deciding whether or not a witness is telling the truth is the jury and the jury alone, and they found Fry guilty of second-degree murder. The Court of Appeals heard the case in November 1923, and again it was thrown out. The court concluded that Marston's deception test had not been accepted by the scientific community, so it had no place in a court of law. Since that date in late 1923, with very few exceptions, the lie detector has never been admissible in a U.S. criminal trial. That same year, John Larson, Gus Vollmer, and Leonarde Keeler all left Berkeley, and Keeler set about redesigning Larson's prototype, creating his own version of the machine. While Larson was concerned about the underlying science and the machine's limitations, Keeler had no such concerns. He saw a promising and lucrative future for himself and his improved lie detector. He wanted to put his machine to work at the heart of American crime: Chicago. Organized crime had taken hold of the city, and when 7 members of Chicago's North Side gang were murdered by members of Al Capone's gang in what became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, a group of businessmen got together and funded a national institution for solving crime. The Scientific Crime Detection Laboratory was established at Chicago's Northwestern University in late 1929. Leonarde Keeler became the lab's expert in lie detection. He was the laboratory's poster boy, and his redesigned lie detector was the jewel in the crown. Keeler's updated machine was a compact and more user-friendly version of John Larson's original design. He also added a new feature, a pair of electrodes measuring the skin's conductivity. Keeler believed that when a subject lied, they would sweat more, and the electrodes would detect the change in the conductivity of the skin. He named his new and improved device the Polygraph, a name that refers to any device that records multiple inputs. But Keeler patented the machine and made the name his own. And he didn't just make changes to the mechanics of the machine. Keeler's true refinements were to the smoke and mirrors of the lie detector's operation, taking inspiration from his time as a budding magician. One of his trademark methods was to begin each interview with the card trick test.
You take 5 diamonds? No.
While rigged to the polygraph, a subject would be instructed to pick one of 8 playing cards, and then place it back among the others without showing the chosen card to Keeler.
Did you take the 6 of clubs? No.
He would then go through the cards one by one, showing them to the subject and asking, "Is this your card?" The subject was instructed to lie when they saw their chosen card. However, Keeler was always able to identify which card the subject had chosen. He insisted it was because the polygraph machine was infallible and had detected the lie. But really, Keeler used sleight of hand to identify the chosen card. It was a means to an end. If the examiner could convince the test subject that the machine could accurately detect lies, the more dramatic the results would be. While Keeler was working at the crime lab, William Marston rebounded from his rejection by the courts and in 1928 debuted a rebranded deception test, calling it the Love Meter, and along with it, the explosive finding that brunettes are more loving and passionate than blondes. Marston's academic career had begun to fall apart, but luckily, the entertainment media couldn't get enough of the Love Meter, and it caught the attention of the head of Universal Studios in Hollywood. Carl Laemmle hired Marston to measure the emotional responses of audiences during test screenings of the studio's latest films. Marston's relationship with Universal only lasted a year, and in late 1929, the job was handed to Leonarde Keeler. Keeler also didn't last long in the role. He felt the movie business was a distraction from his work at the crime lab, but it made him realize that there was a huge potential market for his machine outside of criminal investigation. While investigating a number of crimes at Chicago banks, Keeler convinced the bank's management to test their workforce. He promised that his polygraph would make the tested employees the bank's most honest employees. And soon, he was finding work in insurance companies and banks, and then in all sorts of corporate settings. What was initially a side hustle to his main job at the crime lab soon became his main source of income. But crime was still a growth industry. In 1931, the Wickersham Commission, charged with reviewing the U.S. criminal justice system under Prohibition, delivered its report. August Vollmer was one of the authors of the Wickersham Report. It revealed just how extensive police brutality was in the interrogation room. The third degree, a practice that Gus Vollmer and John Larson had hoped to end back in Berkeley, was being used with brutal efficiency across the U.S. The details shocked the American public, and the Supreme Court moved to ban the practice. The polygraph now took center stage in the fight against crime. But the way police were using the machine was a far cry from what John Larson had envisaged. police interrogators trained by Keeler got 60% of those they accused of lying to confess, whereas Larson's method resulted in a confession only about 6% of the time. Larson's supporters claimed that they were using the instrument simply as an aid in investigation and not a means of bluffing an individual into a confession. But Keeler's form of bluffing proved more compatible with what police were looking for. Larson believed Keeler had invented a psychological third degree. It was a perversion of the lofty ideals of the original lie detector, and Larson found an unlikely ally in his quiet war with Leonarde Keeler. By the late 1930s, William Marston had walked away from academia, the law, and the movie business, and in 1938 he published a book called The Lie Detector Test. In it, he attacked Keeler and his methods, not because he shared John Larson's ideals, but because his ego couldn't allow Leonarde Keeler to become the face of lie detection. And it worked. Later that year, Marston landed a new job. He took his lie detector to New York and the ad agencies on Madison Avenue. There, he interviews a group of men who are product testing Gillette razor blades. And perhaps unsurprisingly, Marston finds that all the men prefer using Gillette blades. The client, however, wants a second opinion, and they decide to go to John Larson, who, surprisingly, considering what we know about the man, agrees to do it. Larson conducts a similar test, but he finds the results to be about 50-50. Half the men like the Gillette blade, the other half like the competitor's product. This isn't at all the result that William Marston was looking for. He suggests a payment of $30,000 if Larson validates Marston's results. But rather than accept the bribe, Larson reports Marston to the FBI. He avoids criminal charges, but he had burned another bridge. But again, Marston would land on his feet. In 1941, he started working as an educational consultant at All American Publications and pitched an idea for a new character based on the unconventional, liberated, and powerful modern woman. All American Publications would become DC Comics, and Marston's character became known as Wonder Woman. Her most powerful weapon was a golden lasso that could compel anyone to tell the truth. The character was as innovative as it was popular, but Marston only had a short time to enjoy his success. In 1944, he contracted polio, was diagnosed with cancer the following year, and died in May of 1947. After the Second World War, a new Cold War begins almost immediately. It's a new struggle with a new enemy: communism. Fearing that Soviet agents could infiltrate and subvert American society and industry, authorities turn to the polygraph. Leonarde Keeler is summoned to a facility in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where, as part of the government's nuclear weapons program, uranium is being enriched. His orders were to determine the loyalty, reliability, and mental stability of all 5,000 of the plant's employees. And as this paranoia about the internal communist threat was reaching fever pitch, in the summer of 1948, Keeler becomes embroiled in a public show trial. The House Committee on Un-American Activities was created in 1938 to investigate alleged disloyalty and subversive activities by citizens suspected of having communist ties. In August of 1948, Whittaker Chambers, a writer and self-confessed member of a group called the Communist Underground, testifies that US diplomat Alger Hiss is a communist agent. The committee was not convinced, and Hiss denied the allegations. He was a popular figure, well-educated and well-connected. But he had an enemy on the committee, a young congressman called Richard Nixon.
I am holding in my hand a microfilm of the most confidential, highly secret State Department documents. This microfilm was made for the purpose of transmitting these documents in reduced form to the Soviet Union. The documents were obtained from State Department employees who were communists and who were interested in sending those documents to the Soviet Union, where the interests of the Soviet Union were in direct conflict with the United States.
The question was simple. Who was telling the truth, Alger Hiss or Whittaker Chambers? Nixon decides to spring a trap. On August 16th, as the hearing was wrapping up, Nixon asks Hiss, "Under the circumstances, will you be willing to take a lie detector test?" He assures Hiss that the test will be carried out by Leonarde Keeler himself. Hiss understands the law and presents 2 pages of objections, refusing the test. Nixon, however, understands political theater and the role of the press. The diplomat's refusal to take the test is all he needs. Alger Hiss is found guilty in the court of public opinion, and more importantly, a grand jury finds him guilty of 2 counts of perjury. The trial and the press surrounding it propelled Nixon into the limelight. In the 1952 presidential election, General Dwight Eisenhower picked Nixon to be his running mate. The duo won the election, and Nixon became vice president. Despite being a controversial figure throughout his political career, in 1969 he won the presidency for himself, and the rest, as they say, is history. Leonarde Keeler didn't fare as well. After the Hiss trial, his marriage fell apart, and in 1948 he suffered a major stroke and died a year later. He was just 45. At the time, John Larson was working as the medical director of the Logansport State Hospital, a psychiatric facility in Indiana. He continued to use the polygraph as a treatment tool, but with limited success. Over the years, he had become disillusioned with his creation and how it had developed in the hands of Keeler and Marston. He watched as the polygraph moved beyond law enforcement, beyond military intelligence, and into the workforce. Millions of ordinary Americans were subjected to polygraph tests at work, often in an unethical way. At the State Department, hundreds of homosexuals were outed using polygraph tests and fired in what was known as the Lavender Scare or the Purge of the Perverts. The pervasive belief was that the lie detector was never wrong. But even as far back as 1921, Larson, Keeler, and Marston knew that was a lie. But by the 1980s, the lie detector had spread throughout the US economy. Half of all retail businesses were subjecting their employees to polygraph tests. When President Reagan attempted to expand the use of the polygraph, things finally came to a head. Responding to the public outcry, Congress passed the Polygraph Protection Act, effectively banning the use of the polygraph in a business setting. In 2002, the National Academy of Sciences concluded in a report that the scientific evidence supporting the accuracy of the polygraph to detect deception is intrinsically susceptible to producing erroneous results. In short, polygraph testing is an unacceptable choice. But the quest for the perfect lie detector goes on. Products like No Lie MRI, Eye Detect, and Avatar are being considered for law enforcement, covert intelligence, and airport security applications. The polygraph, or new versions of the device, seem to be here to stay. John Larson died of a heart attack in September 1965. He was 74 years old. Shortly before his death, he wrote, "Beyond my expectations, through uncontrollable factors, this scientific investigation became, for practical purposes, a Frankenstein's monster, which I have spent over 40 years combating." Thanks for watching, and if you liked this video, here are a few others you might enjoy.